Alright, these are your notes for section 8.4 and 8.5 on squares. Alright, we already know, I think everybody knows how to identify a square. If you saw a square, you'd be able to know what it was. We're going to give it a more formal definition, and then we're going to talk about its properties. A square is a parallelogram with 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides. Okay? Now let's talk about this definition. First thing that stands out is that it's a parallelogram. Okay? Another specific type of parallelogram. Second thing, it has 4 right angles. Well, we've already learned a shape that has 4 right angles, and it's called a rectangle. Okay? So a square is a rectangle by its definition. The rest of the definition says, and 4 congruent sides, which was our definition for a rhombus. So a square ends up being all 3 of these shapes. It's a specific type of parallelogram, a special type of rectangle, and a special type of rhombus. Okay? Let's mark these ideas in our picture here. All 4 sides are congruent. Parallelogram. And then it has 4 right angles. So this is what we know from the definition. Okay? Parallel sides, all 4 sides the same length, and it has right angles. Now I'm going to draw you this Venn diagram again, and it's going to change a little bit from the one we had in a rhombus. Okay, we start with our quadrilaterals. We have a special type of quadrilateral called parallelograms. Then we have our rectangles. We have our rhombuses. And then right here in the overlap, since a square is both rectangle and a rhombus, that overlap is where squares are. Okay, so here's our Venn diagram. Big circle for quadrilaterals. More specific set of the circle is parallelograms. And then inside the parallelogram circle, we have 2 circles that overlap, rectangles and rhombuses, and they overlap because a square is both a rectangle and a rhombus. Now we're going to talk about the properties here. Since a square is a parallelogram, a rectangle, and a rhombus, it has everything that we've talked about. We're going to list those out. Okay, parallelogram. Opposite sides are congruent. Opposite angles are congruent. Consecutive angles are supplementary. And the diagonals bisect each other, cut each other in half. Okay, those are ideas from a parallelogram. Ideas from a rectangle. We said it has 4 sides, 4 right angles, which is in our definition for a square, and that your diagonals are congruent. Okay? So in addition to bisecting each other, they're also congruent. That was your rectangle. For a rhombus, we said 4 sides were congruent. We also said diagonals perpendicular to each other. Means they make 90-degree angles. And then the diagonals bisect the angles. Okay? So all of this stuff applies to squares. Okay? Now, we're not going to do an example, but I'm going to give you a couple pointers, a couple things to remember about squares, because if you can solve rectangles, if you can solve a rhombus, then you can solve a square, because it's just combining those ideas together. First one here. Remember we said since the diagonals are congruent and they bisect each other like they do in a rectangle, that these 4 segments are all congruent. Okay, that's important. We also said that the diagonals are perpendicular. Okay, so we have a right angle there in the middle. The last thing we said, or we talked about, is that the diagonals bisect the angles. Well, if the angles are 90, that means every angle here is 45 degrees. Okay? All of those angles are 45. And what can happen then is that we end up with 45, 45, 90 triangles. So you may need to go back and review your rules on 45, 45, 90 triangles. Remember, this is n root 2, and these are both n because they're congruent. All right? That can't apply to this. We can have small ones. This is also, this part of the square is also a 45, 45, 90 triangle. Okay, this is half of a square, and this is a quarter of a square. So you can have several different types of 45, 45, 90 triangles. The last one, we said all four sides are the same length, okay, and they're parallel, which we drew in our top picture, okay, with right angles. So, all of those ideas can come together here for a square. You need to make sure that as long as you understand parallelograms and rhombuses, then you'll be able to understand a square because it just combines all those ideas together. You just need to remember that a square is a parallelogram, a rhombus, and a rectangle. If you have any questions, go back and watch the video. If you still have questions, then bring them to class next time.